Hi, I'm Tom Makes Things. You might not be able to see it on camera, but it's quite dark in here. Do you find that scary? It is a bit scary. Do you like it? That would be weird, wouldn't it? Nobody actually likes to be scared. Why would you? It's not a nice emotion. It's the emotion that exists to tell you, get out of there! You're in danger! But what about this? Or this?
I just want to apologize.
Or even this?
Looks like somebody's having a bad dream. Bad dream. A bad dream. Bad dream.
Well, those are scary. They're meant to be scary, that's the point. But it's possible, likely even, that you search them out. Enjoy them. Complain when they're not scary enough. Well, that's really weird, isn't it? Hello. How did he get in here? This is the first bear I ever had, back when I was really tiny. I don't think I ever gave him a name. He's always just sort of been Bear. He's got a bell. I'll pop him down here. Horror's been around since the start. A lot of it comes from folklore. The first mention of a werewolf is possibly from the Epic of Gilgamesh. That's the first written story anywhere, ever, that we know of. You've got Dracula, who Bram Stoker supposedly based on Vlad the Impaler, and you've got your zombies, spelt without an E, from Haitian mythology. Scary stories exist in every culture around the world, with surprising similarities. The start of modern horror can be a little ill-defined. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, perhaps, written in 1816, the year without summer. Pretty scary. Or some H.G. Wells. A lot of his writing is more sci-fi, but tinged with horror. I think so. The Turn of the Screw by Henry James. Clearly horror, right? But modern horror? H.P. Lovecraft then, surely. Well, yes, but his work didn't really become popular until the 70s. M.R. James's classic ghost stories. The films of George Méliès, possibly the first ever horror cinema. Night of the Living Dead, The Exorcist, Stephen King. Okay, my point is there's always been horror and there's even more of it around today. TheNumbers.com estimates that horror floats around a 5% market share of all film tickets sold. People love this stuff. Look at the success of YouTube channels like Dead Meat or Wendigoon. The appetite is there, but it doesn't immediately make sense why. Where did the bear go? Let me read you this quote from David Hume all the way back in 1757. "It seems an unaccountable pleasure which the spectators of a well-written tragedy receive from sorrow, terror, anxiety, and other passions that are in themselves disagreeable and uneasy. The more they are touched and affected, the more they are delighted by the spectacle. They are pleased in proportion as they are afflicted, and never so happy as when they employ tears, sobs, cries to give vent to their sorrows and relieve their heart, swollen with the tenderest sympathy and compassion." This is, as we would expect from Hume, perceptive. He's struck on a couple of theories for why we like to consume media that is quote-unquote unpleasant. He has brought up what Noel Carroll refers to as the paradox of horror, as in, people enjoy horror in proportion to how horrific and terrible it is. The more awful and terrible, the more people like it, or are fascinated by it. Paul Bloom, author of this book, How Pleasure Works, makes an interesting point about the paradox of horror. Often, the enjoyment of the depraved is seen as low class. Few would suggest that the Saw films are highbrow entertainment, but that doesn't mean the paradox of horror only applies to low class people. It is, in fact, universal. Bloom gives the example of the play Blasted by Sarah Kane, which has a third scene that is a tad too graphic for me to describe on YouTube. Sure, I'm thinking about the children, but I'm mostly thinking about ever getting this channel monetized. The point Bloom makes is that this scene, far from putting off the highbrow theatre-going gentry of London, actually enthused them to come to the play all the more. And this wasn't a long time ago either. The play premiered in 1995. I suppose my point is, this phenomena isn't classist. People are. Okay, back to Hume. Hume says that these extreme emotions can be used to give vent to people's sorrows and relieve their hearts. This sounds to me a lot like catharsis. Catharsis was a term coined by Aristotle and then expanded on by Sigmund Freud. According to Bloom, the theory goes that certain events initiate a psychological purging process. By inducing extreme emotions, you can deal with unconscious emotions that may be affecting your daily life. Hence, people enjoy horror because it allows you to experience these extreme emotions, and then afterwards, you're freed of your psychological burdens. Lovely! And Bloom argues, wrong. Put it this way, if a horror film was purging you, no pun intended, of your internal struggles, you would finish a horror film more relaxed than when you started. Not even the hardiest horror fan would suggest that that's what they feel when the credits roll, nor would they want to. The point of the experience is to get amped up and excited. If you feel super calm walking out of a horror film, it's probably not a very good horror film. Therefore, Bloom doesn't think, and I agree with him, that catharsis is a very good explanation for our enjoyment of horror. Wait, what's that? What's my name, Tom? That's a bit weird, isn't it? I think we struck on something there. A second ago I said the aim of a horror film is to get amped up and excited by the experience. Of course it is. The horror film induces fear and then you feel a fight or flight response. I'm sure you already know what that is, but if you don't, I'll explain. When faced with a challenging situation, your body prepares you to do either of two things. Let's say your name is Mr. Caveman and you've bumped into Mr. Hungry Saber-toothed Tiger. Your body decides that you have two options. One, you decide to fight Mr. Hungry Saber-toothed Tiger with whatever weapons you have on you. That's the fight part of fight or flight. Or two, you could choose to cut your losses and run away from Mr. Hungry Saber-toothed Tiger. That would be the flight part of fight or flight. Your body prepares you to do this by pumping you full of hormones, principally adrenaline. The adrenaline does a few things. It increases your heart rate, it makes you more alert, it makes sure more sugar is going to your muscles, and as the name suggests, it makes you need to pee, so you're not carrying around any extra weight if you need to do any fighting or flighting. All of these things will help you against Mr. Hungry Saber-toothed Tiger. Nowadays, of course, it's not often that you have to worry about fighting Mr. Hungry Saber-toothed Tiger, and so instead our bodies have focused our fight and flight responses on other things. This is why you might feel sweaty or nervous before a big sports match or a big meeting, or you go up on stage. The same is true of watching a horror film. The film is scary, and so your brain prepares you to fight or flight with adrenaline, and the adrenaline feels good. This is made worse because adrenaline isn't the only hormone released in a fight or flight response. Your brain is also supplied with endorphins and dopamine. Endorphins and dopamine are there to numb any pain you might be about to feel when you get bitten by Mr. Hungry Saber-toothed Tiger. These endorphins and dopamine feel even better than the adrenaline, and the better you feel might suddenly start outweighing the "ah" you get from the horror. And so suddenly, the horror feels good. It's the exact same reason people enjoy roller coasters. You get an adrenaline rush. However, for the good feelings of the horror to outweigh the "ah" of the horror, 3 conditions need to be fulfilled to build what psychologist Michael J. Apter called a protective frame. People who enjoy consuming horror media wouldn't necessarily enjoy living in an actual haunted house because these 3 conditions wouldn't be met there. 1. You need to believe that you're physically safe. In the real haunted house, the real ghost might hurt you. But in the horror movie haunted house, nothing's going to hurt you. Nothing can hurt you. You'll be fine. 2. You need to be able to detach yourself from the situation. The monster in the film can be rationalized as, oh, it's a monster in the film. You have detachment. But the monster in the haunted house is in the haunted house. You can't suddenly remember that it's not real and doesn't matter, because it is real and it does matter. And 3, you need to be confident that you can overcome the danger. In the context of a horror film, that means you can pause it. Any perceived danger the vampire in the film poses to you can be eliminated the moment you stop it from moving. I think this is why games like Doki Doki Literature Club can be so scary. At certain points in the game, characters tell you to pause or save it. This causes events to start occurring outside of the context of the game. You can no longer be sure of your ability to overcome the danger. If you can fulfill these 3 criteria, then you can experience a warm, tingly soup of chemicals coming to your brain, while understanding that the actual danger is minimal, and so the horrific experience becomes worth it. The psychologist Paul Rosen suggests this is an example of benign masochism, and it's the bliss of chemical soup and sensation you get after the horror that makes it enjoyable. Masochism, for those younger members of my audience, is not to be googled, but basically just means the way people like to hurt themselves, just a little bit. Rosen suggests it's comparable to stepping into a bath that's too hot, or eating food that's too spicy. It's worth doing those things for the eventual good temperature of the bath and the nice flavour of the spicy food. And so, over time, you train yourself to like the painful first bit, because you know the nice second bit won't be far behind. This aligns with Gilles Deleuze's thoughts on masochism. He said masochism is all about suspense and fantasy, and not about the pain itself. I would suggest that suspense and fantasy are 2 fundamentals of horror. Good horror, like good comedy, is all about build-up. People see random jump scares as cheap, and are generally more impressed if a filmmaker or game designer can construct a sense of creeping dread. Perhaps the biggest reason you might experience pleasure through pain is because the pain in masochism is chosen. You want to watch horror, and you choose to look away if it gets too much. You choose to eat spicy food, and you choose to drink milk if it gets too much. Masochism is too often associated with involuntary loss of control. You have pain or fear inflicted on you, and you don't choose it. That's not what it is. Otherwise, it wouldn't fulfill the 3rd criteria for a protective frame. Masochism is really about controlling loss of control. This all begs a more fundamental question, though. Why do horror films scare us at all? Do we think they're real as we watch them? You know, fundamentally, when you watch a film, that it isn't real. So how come you get scared by it? Well, humans are capable of some impressive mental feats. We can meta-represent. Deirdre Wilson describes meta-representation as our ability to represent a higher-order representation with a lower-order representation embedded within it. In Jonathan Haidt's book The Righteous Mind, he talks about humanity's great psychological crossing of the Rubicon being our development of shared intentionality, a term coined by Michael Tomasello. Shared intentionality is the ability to look at someone doing something, realise what they're doing, and help them with it. Tomasello is a comparative psychologist, which means he works a lot with primates, and he believes that it's inconceivable you could see that behaviour in primates. We are special. Okay, well, once you understand what someone else is trying to do and you engage with that, suddenly you can do all sorts of other things. Language becomes possible. You can't create a language unless you understand that the words you say and think mean something mean the same thing to someone else. But with shared intentionality, you can. You can also start comprehending things that are false while appreciating that others might believe they're true. Paul Bloom gives this example. Mary says she doesn't want to get wet and that she wants an umbrella, so she walks to the closet. You watch this and generate the belief. Mary thinks the umbrella is in the closet. This is a special sort of thought because you can hold it in your mind while believing the embedded sentence is false. It is perfectly possible to believe that Mary thinks the umbrella is in the closet and to believe the umbrella is not there, it is actually in the living room. This is meta-representation. Your higher order representation is that Mary thinks the umbrella is in the closet, but your embedded lower order representation is that you know it's in the living room. Once you can hold thoughts that don't reflect your true beliefs about reality, Then you can imagine things. You can imagine things that might happen in the future. You can fantasize. You can tell stories. You can write down stories. You understand these things don't have to be real, and so does everyone around you. This could all just be a side effect of shared intentionality. But, with all of that said, the emotions triggered by these falsehoods and stories are real. We know they're real. If a psychologist wants to make someone sad for an experiment, they show them a sad video. They don't tinker with the person's actual life. That would be, and this is true, unethical. If you want someone to get over a snake phobia, you ask them to imagine a snake before you force them to look at a photo or interact with a real snake. So, there's something that overrides our knowledge that stories aren't true. Bloom thinks this thing is Aliefs, like beliefs, but instead of B, A. This is a term coined by Tamar Gendler, and Bloom describes the concept thus. Beliefs are attitudes we hold in response to how things are. Aliefs are more primitive. They are responses to how things seem. I'll give you an example. When I was younger, I went up the Shard in London. There are 2 viewing decks in the Shard, one which is enclosed and one which is partially open air. Young Tom was hardly fazed at all by the enclosed deck. He happily leant against the glass and gazed out across London. His belief about the deck's safety matched his Aliefs about it being enclosed. On the other hand, when young Tom explored the open-air deck, he found himself suffering a significant bout of vertigo and he could barely walk out onto the deck. It was just as safe, nettings and railings aplenty, and young Tom believed this. But the open air triggered young Tom's Aliefs to suspect danger and reject the experience. Bloom and Gendler suggest these Aliefs are what's responsible for you experiencing emotions in response to things you know to be fake. I think this is true, but if you'll entertain my slightly hacked science, I think that there is something else, or possibly the same thing in different clothes, at play here. In the righteous mind, hate discusses mirror neurons. Mirror neurons are neurons that fire when you do an action, but also fire when you see someone else doing the action, or imagine doing the action, or even imply someone else is going to do the action. They were discovered by accident in chimps in the 80s and have been confirmed in humans since. They explain why you feel the urge to smile when you see someone else smile. As Haidt puts it, the other person is effectively smiling in your brain. I think the mirror neuron system explains a lot about how we interpret fiction. I want to run a little experiment. Close your eyes. Are they closed? Try to imagine yourself standing by the sea with the waves crashing against the shore. Have you done it? Apologies to aphantasiacs, but to everyone else, did you imagine yourself standing in the first person, within your own body, or the third person, looking at yourself from the outside? First, right? I didn't say you had to imagine yourself from your perspective. When you imagine something, psychologists describe it as being transported, because you imagine it through your own eyes. This makes sense if your mirror neuron system is firing as if you're really there. Now, I think the same thing happens when you watch a horror film. Your mirror neurons fire as if you're in the experience the characters are. Your brain simulates their fear. Obviously, it's lessened because you're not really experiencing those things. You have your protective frame from earlier. And so, my theory is that Aliefs are a philosophical explanation of the mirror neuron system, or at least in some way linked. When young Tom went onto the open-air deck of the Shard, he could suddenly feel the wind on his face, and his mirror neuron system started frantically simulating what it would be like if he fell. That's why the open-air deck was so much scarier. His Aliefs were being made manifest. And here's the thing. Studies have found that psychopaths have underdeveloped mirror neuron systems, and some people think that psychopaths have reduced responses to horror films. Psychologists Raymond Marr and Keith Oakley have suggested the reasons humans enjoy fiction are to develop social expertise. And this makes sense if your mirror neuron system is reflecting the negative and positive experiences of characters right back onto you. Oh my gosh, I've got it! It's the Croods! It's all the Croods! Hear me out here. The Croods is the answer. You know that scene early on in the Croods where Dad Crood tells stories to the little Croods, and they're scary stories about a bear, I don't know the bear's name, who keeps trying new things and then dies, and then Dad Crood does the handprint because the bear is dead. It's not important. The point is, that's how horror must have started. Fiction to teach people what to avoid, presented that way to start triggering people's mirror neuron systems. It's all the Croods. It has been all along. It's all the Croods. It's possible I got carried away with the Croods. It may also be worth pointing out that my theory about Aliefs and the mirror neuron system being the same is very much just that. It's a theory. I have no proof. I'm also now in a forest. You might have noticed there's been some slightly odd stuff going on, and I just felt like I kind of needed to... Okay, so where are we up to? Well, we've decided that catharsis probably doesn't explain our enjoyment of horror, but we think that our chemical responses to scary situations and our tendency for benign masochism might. We now understand metarepresentation and how it allows us to create and understand fiction. And we see how Aliefs and maybe the mirror neuron system counter this by undercutting what we believe to be false. Finally, at the end there, we struck on how the evolutionary purpose of fiction might be to help us navigate social situations. Fiction, more often than not, tries to make you forget that it's fiction, and we as consumers, more often than not, try and forget that as well. The writer Elmore Leonard uses the term hoop-de-doodle to describe stuff that reminds you of a piece of fiction's fictionitude. That's my word. Despite this, your knowledge of a piece of fiction's fictionitude forces you to see it in a different way. Bloom uses the example of an art gallery, which you walk around and notice there's a window which looks like it might have a nice view. On approaching the window, you realise that the window isn't in fact a window, but it's actually a hyper-realistic painting of a window and the view beyond it. You may have enjoyed the view from the window before, but now you enjoy the not a window in a new way. It has intention. In the context of horror, its fictionitude allows you to feel safe. There are 3 levels to this safety, and they are similar to the 3 things you needed to develop a protective frame from earlier. Because horror is fiction, you know that you personally are in no danger, regardless of what happens. You also know that the character's danger is simulated. It isn't real, and therefore their suffering doesn't really matter. This also means that you're absolved of guilt or responsibility from watching it. Finally, fiction is predeterministic in a way that real life is not. Everything, theoretically, is intentional. Across your whole life, you spend an average of 91 days on the toilet, but this is very rarely shown in films unless your name is John Travolta. I expressed this concept in my notes for this section as there's no such thing as Chekhov's gun IRL. What I mean by that is if someone puts a gun in your room on Monday morning, there's no rule of reality that means the gun has to have been fired by Monday evening. But if a gun was put somewhere in a film, it probably has to be fired. If you flip this the other way round, you know that if the main character is in a perilous situation 13 minutes into a 90-minute film, they probably aren't going to die. You have assurance of safety from that. Children don't have such strong grasps on narratives as adults, and they struggle to control the balance of A-leafs and B-leafs in their brain, and so they are more likely to be concerned by the events in a film. For my 5th birthday, I went to see Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs with my parents. At the end, there's this scene where it looks as if the main character, Flint Lockwood, might have died. Very young Tom's brain had become so connected with this character that he was almost inconsolable, wailing in despair in this otherwise silent cinema auditorium. He couldn't, at that point, comprehend how unlikely it was that this bouncy animated kids film would kill off the main character. My parents, for their parts, found my anguish hilarious. This is exactly the reason, aside from often subject matter, that you shouldn't show horror films to young children. It will be too much for them. The emotions it triggers will be too real. This safety in the context of fiction is what allows you to enjoy horror as benign masochism we talked about earlier. It gives you control. It's almost like an expansion of the 3rd component required for your protective frame. The safety of fiction also allows it to act as a place of emotional play fighting, as Bloom puts it. You can practice emotional distress in a safe environment, like the dad Croods stories for his children. Stephen King refers to horror as the tough mind's way of coping with terrible problems. People often fantasize about bad things happening and wondering how they deal with that. I know I do. Horror can be a manifestation of that. Horror can also be a safe way for people to exercise dangerous or unacceptable fantasies. Anyone who's ever played The Sims knows the joy of trapping one of your sins in a tiny swimming pool without a way out and waiting until they drown. It's morbid curiosity. And hence the horror film 12 Feet Deep. Both of these uses of horror encourage pushing it to extremity. The more extreme the horror, the more likely it will surpass your morbid curiosity and be able to shock you. And even if the story is entirely extreme or unrealistic, you can still draw lessons from the actions of the characters. You aren't really learning how to survive the zombie apocalypse. You are learning about teamwork, the limits of morality, and the dangers of rampant capitalism. What I'm saying is that horror fiction might have some real evolutionary benefits. It's a place to explore otherwise unthinkable moral scenarios. And I haven't even mentioned the social benefits of sharing extreme emotions like fear or sadness with those around you. If you want to form a close bond with someone, get scared together. Sharing extreme emotions builds a lot of trust. I guess the point is that horror can be enjoyed or not enjoyed for a lot of different reasons. And the reasons we enjoy it at all are not necessarily dissimilar from the reasons we might enjoy any fiction. Fiction might just be a byproduct of shared intentionality, or it might be for disseminating moral lessons, or it might be for encouraging cooperation and teamwork. Like any art form, directors and writers and game designers will all approach horror with different ideals and concerns about what horror can be and what horror should be. For my part, I love horror and I'm really excited to see where the internet is taking it. Where's that coming from? You should have given me a name, Tom. I don't like horror anymore. I don't like horror anymore.